Well, have you noticed the leaves are changing colors and pumpkins are starting to show up on porches and it's getting nice and cool outside, which means that it must be time once again for our annual 7-week fall series, book study, whatever we want to call it. I think of it as a spiritual intensive where we get to delve into a topic in depth, and this year we've chosen this wonderful book here called Happiness, a guide to developing life's most important skill. The author is Matthew Ricard. Happiness. Happiness. As we think about happiness, we kind of come smack dab up against the news, don't we? The events of the world. Once again, it seems as though the events of the world are vying for our attention. The events of the world don't care what topic I have planned for Sunday. They just happen along as they do. And of course, this week I'm talking about what I can only call the massacre in Las Vegas, which makes happiness sound like a frivolous topic. And it is frivolous, as long as we're stuck with the shallow definition of happiness that we get from pop culture. The English language is really magnificent. It has so much richness and nuance, and yet it can really let us down when it comes to certain ideas. The one that I talk about the most is the word or the idea of love. Take the Greek language, for example. 4 different words for love. Each one means something very different. In the English language, we have one word, which is totally inadequate for the depth of meaning that is trying to be conveyed with the word love. Same thing happens with happiness. Here's the most common meaning that we find. It's basically about pleasure. This is the most common dictionary definition up here. Feeling or showing pleasure or contentment. Some synonyms: cheerful, merry, joyful, jovial, jolly, jocular, gleeful, carefree, satisfied, gratified, buoyant, radiant, sunny, blithe, joyous. Doesn't exactly capture the national mood, does it?
No.
Quite the opposite. Again, if we're stuck with that definition, and I am happy to say that this is not the definition of happiness that's being used in the book that we're working with here. First, let me introduce you to the author. This is Matthew Ricard. He has a very interesting background. As you might have gathered from the picture, from the robes he's wearing, he is a Tibetan Buddhist monk, but that's only for the past 35 years or so. Before that, he had a doctorate in biology from the prestigious Pasteur Institute in France. He started his career working as a cellular biologist, and he's working in a lab that was being run by a scientist who had won the Nobel Prize in medicine. So he had a very promising career in science ahead of him. But at some point, not too far into his career, he found that his life lacked direction. It lacked meaning. So he went to learn about Buddhism from a Tibetan teacher who was living in exile, as most Tibetans are. They're living in exile. This one was in Darjeeling, India, which is in the shadow of the majestic Himalayan mountains. And there's no dramatic story here of some sort of a life-shattering, life-changing event, no apocalyptic revelation like Paul on the road to Damascus or anything like that. He just fell in love with Buddhist philosophy, and he fell in love with the location there in the shadow of the Himalayas. So when he was 26 years old, he left the pleasures of Paris to go live in Darjeeling at a monastery, and he never looked back. He worked with several different Buddhist teachers over the years, and of course he encountered many other monks during his Buddhist studies. And the thing that impressed him the most was that they were so calm. They were so compassionate. They had this deep sense of inner peace that they maintained in all situations, not superficially, but at a very deep level, which he got to know. They had mastered their emotions, and they had mastered whatever else it took to be able to do that. And what Matthew learned was that it's a skill. Doing that is a skill that can be developed by anyone. You don't have to go to India. You don't even have to study Tibetan Buddhism. It's a skill that anyone can learn, and that was to be his life's work. To study what that was all about and then teach others. At first, he was reluctant to use the word happiness to describe what he was seeing, mainly because in France, those French intellectuals in his homeland were notoriously hostile to the notion of happiness. You know, think of these stern existentialists like Sartre and other people like that. So in the book, he had some questions and some concerns that he talks about, and here's what he said. He asked this question. He said, has the word happiness, yeah, that's one of them French people that doesn't like the word happiness. He's asking, has the word happiness itself been so overused that people have given up on it, turned off by the illusions and platitudes it evokes? For some people, talking about the search for happiness seems almost in bad taste. Protected by their armor of intellectual complacency, they sneer at it as they would at a sentimental novel. I guess that means that French intellectuals are a bit snobby, good at sneering. It's not so much the sneering, though. He says it's their complacency. It's their intellectual complacency that's the real problem. Their unwillingness to look beyond the tip of the nose that they're sneering down to see if there's a deeper meaning when it comes to happiness. So, in the face of that kind of conclusion, Matthew Ricard offers a clear definition of happiness as it is going to be used in this book. And we're going to take the definition even deeper, but this is the working definition he gives us. He says, by happiness I mean here a deep sense of flourishing that arises from an exceptionally healthy mind. This is not a mere pleasurable feeling, a fleeting emotion, or a mood, but an optimal state of being. Happiness is also a way of interpreting the world, since, while it may be difficult to change the world, it is always possible to change the way we look at it. Well, that's right up our alley in Unity, isn't it? It's really our core message, and I think it's best stated in our movement by Eric Butterworth. So let's compare for a moment. Let's compare what Eric has to say on the subject with what we just read from Matthew Ricard. Here's Eric. Things may happen around you, things may happen to you, but the only things that really count are the things that happen in you. We can't always control what happens to us, but we can control what we think about what happens. And what we are thinking is our life at any particular moment. It's pretty good. The world changes. It's constantly changing. The only constant is change. We can't always control that, but we can still learn how to thrive. And by the way, thriving is really another way of saying flourishing. That's the word Matthew Ricard uses, thriving, flourishing. So this is part of our mission and purpose here at Unity of Auburn, to add this skill to our spiritual toolbox. And in light of what's in the news this week, this flourishing, this thriving is so important because thriving people don't commit the kind of atrocities that we saw in Las Vegas this last week. Now, we may not be able to reach those people. They may be too far gone. We may not be able to reach the people who have that deep streak of malevolence, who hoard weapons and then dream of acting out their horror story fantasies. We may not be able to reach them, but we can reach the people who have some shred of sanity left. We can reach the sane people in the world, and those are the people who can maybe respond with compassion, with courage, take the appropriate measures to at least reduce the mayhem. I don't listen to these people who, there's so much of this negativity out there that says, well, we'll never completely prevent this from happening again, so why bother? Why bother doing anything? Gun control won't work because we'll never prevent these things from happening again, so let's not do anything. That's crazy. We want to reach the people who are open to this message, who can respond with the courage and compassion that it will take to at least reduce the mayhem, to take measures that are not based on fear and anger, but take measures that are based on a deeper understanding of the human condition. So happiness, as defined by Matthew Ricard, becomes a virtue instead of a frivolous pursuit. He calls the search for happiness a process of purging mental toxins. Purging mental toxins. Here's what he says. The search for happiness is not about looking at life through rose-colored glasses or blinding oneself to the pain and imperfections of the world. It is the purging of mental toxins such as hatred and obsession that literally poison the mind. So where do those toxins come from? Well, Matthew Ricard is a Buddhist, so inevitably the search for happiness is going to start with what he learns from the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism. I'm going to summarize the Four Noble Truths, or maybe say paraphrase them like this. There's a lot of frustration, unhappiness, and discontent in the world. I don't care how well your life seems to be going right now. I don't think anyone would disagree with me when I say we look around at the world and it's easy to find lots of frustration, unhappiness, and discontent. At least that. Another word for those things is suffering. They are a form of suffering. Those mental toxins that he talks about, they're caused by suffering, and the cause of suffering is ignorance. Those are the Four Noble Truths, paraphrased. The cause of suffering is ignorance. Now, suffering is largely a matter of degree. There's a whole spectrum. It can run from probably the worst extreme, which is the kind of suffering that accompanies the death of a loved one and a senseless act of violence like we saw in Las Vegas last week. That's at one extreme. And then there's the opposite extreme. That vague sense of discontent that arises when the world and our lives don't quite seem to be working the way we think they should work. And nobody is saying that we shouldn't experience those things. We're not stuffing our feelings. No one's saying we shouldn't experience those things, but for many people, that can destroy any chance of happiness or any chance of developing that sense of deep flourishing. That doesn't have to happen. That doesn't have to happen. So the reason that folks so often seem to get stuck in discontent and suffering, according to the author, is ignorance. Now, we're not talking about culpable ignorance here. He's not using the word as an insult. What he means by ignorance is this. This is the definition. Ignorance, in the Buddhist lexicon, is an inability to recognize the true nature of things and of the law of cause and effect that governs happiness and suffering. It's part of the human condition. Even the Buddha suffered from this ignorance until the moment of what we call his enlightenment. The ignorance was dispelled by the light of truth. Ignorance comes in different forms, and the two basic ones we're going to be working with is, number one, the ignorance of the true nature and causes of happiness. How we get so mixed up about what it is that makes for happiness. That's number one. And the next most common form of ignorance is our inability to distinguish between reality and the story that we tell about that reality. Another way of putting it is that we often cause much of our own suffering by entertaining thoughts which distort the plain, basic reality of the situation. Again, part of the human condition. It's not culpable, it's just the way things work, something that, again, the Buddha realized. Here's a good example of that. Have you ever been insulted by someone? Have you ever been insulted? What did it feel like physically to be insulted? Was there ever, say, the heat of a little anger? A burning in the pit of the stomach? Maybe some tightness? Maybe a little fist clenched down at your side as you listen to the insult? Maybe even a fight or flight response? Because we're conditioned deeply by our culture to respond to an insult emotionally. Our culture encourages it. Don't take nothing from no one. Someone insults you, hurt them. Maybe just a little bit. Hurt them. But what's the reality? Not the distorted reality created by our culturally conditioned consciousness, but what is the simple reality of an insult? There is no existential threat. There is nothing to justify a flight or fight response. Just words. That's all. And yet, we give those words the power to destroy our tranquility and inner peace. We do it. Ancient Stoic philosophy tells us how to deal with insults. This is something from one of the founders of Greek Stoicism, Epictetus. Here's what he says. He says, if anyone tells you that a certain person speaks ill of you, do not make excuses about what is said of you, but answer, he was ignorant of my other faults, else he would not have mentioned these alone. I love reading Epictetus. And here's a modern, more conventional way of putting it. If someone says that you're dumb as a post, tell them this. You give me too much credit, I'm actually a lot dumber than a post. Think about it. Think about it. Which person is in control in that situation? Which one sees the situation for what it really is? Who has the better grasp on reality? Who is being mean and who is responding with humor? Which one is showing self-control? And if you did do something really dumb, well, there might be some useful information that can be used for self-improvement if you're listening instead of just blindly reacting. Move on and maintain inner peace. That's the message. So we're going to start wrapping things up for today with two practices that we can start using to dispel or at least minimize the effects of this basic ignorance that he's talking about. The author calls these two practices analysis and contemplation. Analysis and contemplation. So here's how he defines analysis. Analysis consists of a candid and systematic evaluation of every aspect of our own suffering and of the suffering we inflict on others. 12-step folks, you might be familiar with this. It sounds very similar to the idea of a personal inventory, but it's a lot older than the 12-step movement. And this isn't about guilt-tripping ourselves. It's about cultivating consistent and persistent self-awareness. And self-awareness is the core, essential component for emotional and spiritual intelligence. And those of you who have the book, you may have noticed that there's a foreword to the book written by Goleman, who is the person who basically coined the term emotional intelligence. He's the expert in that field. So this is really important stuff. All right, the second practice of contemplation is something that builds on what we discern during analysis. We go through our analysis, and then we use contemplation to do something very important. The contemplative approach, he tells us, consists of rising above the whirlpool of our thoughts for a moment and looking calmly within, as if at an interior landscape, to find the embodiment of our deepest aspirations. That's an important part of the practice as well. Karen led you through a meditation this morning that can help with that. And this is just a start. We're going to be working on this for the next 6 Sundays. We'll get into more of the practice next week, but for now, we start with analysis and contemplation, and you can use the exercises. There's a handout in your bulletin. There are 2 exercises on there dealing with these aspects. And in closing, we want to go away remembering that happiness, as we are now defining it, is a worthy goal in and of itself to pursue. Think about it. It's enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, yes, which then gets elevated to the level of virtue when we look at it from this perspective. He says, in brief, the goal of life is a deep state of well-being and wisdom at all moments, accompanied by love for every being. True happiness arises from the essential goodness that wholeheartedly desires everyone to find meaning in their lives. And I hope that you can join us. We'll have a little discussion group at 11:30 in the youth ed area, and I'll see the rest of you next week. Thank you.